You've been thinking about that decision for a while now. Not because you don't know what you want. Not exactly. But every time you get close to choosing, something pulls you back. Another option surfaces, another variable you hadn't considered, another version of yourself that would make a completely different call. And so you stay in the loop, researching and comparing, waiting for some version of certainty that never quite arrives. If you're a millennial, there's a very good chance this is not new information. You probably already have a word for it. What you might not have is the full picture of where it came from and why it runs so much deeper than most people recognize. In 1975, the average American supermarket stocked around 8,800 products. By 2017, that number had climbed past 40,000. That's not a metaphor, that's just jam. But here's what's strange about that number. More choice was supposed to make people happier. That was the assumption baked into the whole modern project. The idea that freedom meant options, and options meant control. And control meant a life you'd actually designed for yourself. And for the generation that came of age right in the middle of that explosion, the millennials, born roughly between 1981 and 1996, the paradox landed hardest. Because you didn't just face more choices than your parents. You faced more choices than any generation in recorded human history at a younger age, with less institutional guidance, and with those choices feeling permanently consequential in a way they never had before. Psychologist Barry Schwartz wrote about this in 2004. His core argument was simple. When you give people too many options, they don't feel liberated. They feel worse. They second-guess whatever they pick. They wonder about the roads not taken. He called it the tyranny of choice. But that book was published before the smartphone existed, before social media, before the algorithm learned to personalize every available option specifically to you. For millennials, the paradox of choice didn't describe the world they were entering, it underestimated it. To understand why this generation struggles to decide, you have to understand what kind of childhood was actually designing their decision-making architecture. Think about the particular moment millennials grew up in. They were children during what sociologists call the era of intensive parenting, a philosophy shift that told parents their involvement, their guidance, their careful orchestration of childhood experiences was directly correlated to outcomes. So you grew up in an environment where a lot of decisions were made on your behalf. Not out of cruelty, out of love. Out of a genuine belief that managing your path would set you up better. You were guided through structured activities. Your afternoons had programs. Your college applications had consultants. The choices that shaped you were, to a significant degree, pre-filtered by adults who wanted to give you every advantage. And then you graduated. The scaffolding came down. And suddenly, for the first time in your adult life, no one was telling you what the next step was. The next step wasn't go to college. It was which college, which city, which field, which relationship structure, which career path, which version of success, which identity. All of it, all at once. Developmental psychologists have a name for this. Jeffrey Arnett coined the term emerging adulthood in 2001 to describe the period between roughly 18 and 25, where identity formation happens through exploration rather than commitment. The problem for millennials is that the exploration period kept extending. The economic conditions that typically anchor that phase, stable employment, affordable housing, reasonable entry points into long-term commitments, those conditions had shifted. And so the window of open choices stayed open far longer than it had for previous generations. You weren't stuck. You were choosing. But when every door seems equally viable and none of them close completely, you can spend a very long time in the hallway. The roots of millennial choice paralysis are partly structural, partly developmental, but then something else happened on top of all of that. The internet arrived, and it didn't just give you more options, it gave you a constant, real-time broadcast of the options other people were choosing. Social comparison is not new. Humans have always measured their lives against the people around them, but the radius of that comparison used to be limited. You compared yourself to your neighborhood, your school, your visible community. The sample size was manageable. By the time millennials hit their late 20s and early 30s, the comparison radius had become effectively infinite. And it wasn't random. The algorithms surfaced the most aspirational content, the most successful outcomes, the most curated versions of the best decisions other people had made, which did something very specific to the internal experience of making a choice. It made every choice feel like a public statement about your life's trajectory. It made the wrong choice feel not just inconvenient, but visible and permanent, and somehow a referendum on who you were. Psychologists who study decision-making make an important distinction here. The thing that freezes people isn't fear of failure, it's fear of regret. Failure you can eventually frame. Regret sits differently. Regret means you saw the better option and didn't take it. And when you can see hundreds of better options simultaneously, in real time, curated specifically for your demographic and interests, the regret potential on any given choice becomes almost unbearable to compute. There's also something happening neurologically that deserves a moment. Researchers at Columbia University and Stanford found that when people are presented with too many options, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning, evaluating, and choosing, doesn't just work harder. It eventually starts to disengage. Decision fatigue is a real cognitive phenomenon. The brain has a limited daily budget for high-stakes evaluation, and a generation that begins every morning with hundreds of micro-choices, from news feeds to streaming queues to app notifications, hits that budget faster. But the deepest amplifier might not be the technology at all. It might be the meaning. Previous generations made decisions within frameworks that, for better or worse, simplified the calculus. Cultural norms, religious traditions, community expectations, they narrowed the options in ways that made choosing feel less like an existential statement and more like the next obvious thing. Millennials came of age at the intersection of the collapse of those frameworks and the explosion of available paths. You were told more explicitly than any generation before you that you could be anything, that you should follow your passion, that the right choice, the authentic choice, the meaningful choice was not just available to you but expected of you. That's not a small thing to carry into a Tuesday afternoon when you're trying to decide whether to change careers. The visible symptom of choice paralysis is inaction, the loops of research that never end, the decisions that stay pending for months, the career pivots that get endlessly rehearsed but never initiated. But there's a cost underneath the inaction that's harder to see, and it tends to do the most damage over time. Psychologist Tal Ben-Shahar describes it as the anxiety of unlived lives. Not the life you're living, the lives you're implicitly declining every time you choose something. When there were fewer paths, there were fewer roads not taken. When there are infinite paths, choosing one means mentally closing all the others. And for a generation raised to believe that all those paths had real potential, that closing feels like loss, which means that even after a decision gets made, it doesn't always feel resolved. The loop can keep running. The comparison window stays open. The alternate timeline plays softly in the background of whatever life you did choose. Research from the University of Michigan found that people who approach decisions as maximizers, always trying to find the objectively best option, consistently report lower life satisfaction than satisficers, people who choose the option that's good enough and stop searching. Not because maximizers make worse choices, often they make better ones on paper, but the mental cost of the search and the lingering awareness of alternatives outweighs the improvement in outcome. Millennials were raised in a cultural moment that told them to maximize, to not settle, to keep their options open, to wait for the right answer. And that framing, while it came from a genuinely hopeful place, became for many a quiet trap. Because an open option isn't freedom, an open option is work. It requires ongoing evaluation and maintenance, takes up cognitive and emotional space, and when you're holding 10 of them simultaneously, you're not liberated, you're occupied. There's something worth naming carefully here. Because this isn't a criticism. It's an observation about a genuinely difficult position. The generation handed the most options in human history also happened to reach adulthood during the 2008 financial crisis, when many of those options turned out to be less stable than they appeared. They were handed a map that showed hundreds of destinations, and then the roads started closing. The paralysis isn't irrational. In many ways, it's a learned and reasonable response to a world that repeatedly punished commitment to paths that then disappeared. If you've watched people do the right thing by conventional markers, degree, steady career, long-term investment, and still find themselves vulnerable, then hesitation starts to look a lot less like weakness and a lot more like wisdom. Choice paralysis in millennials isn't primarily a character flaw or a productivity problem. It's the predictable psychological output of a specific set of conditions, an era of expanding options, a childhood that deferred many early decisions, a digital environment that made all options simultaneously visible and comparison permanently available, and a cultural script that made each choice feel like a statement about the whole of who you are. Understanding that doesn't automatically dissolve the paralysis, but it does change the relationship to it. Because there's a version of this story that pathologizes the individual, that frames the millennial who can't decide as someone who needs to be fixed, who needs more discipline, more decisiveness, more willingness to commit. And that story, while not entirely useless, misses the structural part entirely. Researchers who work in this space consistently find that the most effective antidote to choice paralysis isn't more information. It's constraint, deliberate narrowing, deciding in advance what criteria actually matter, and letting the rest go. Not because the unchosen options have no value, but because the mental and emotional cost of keeping them in play is higher than the benefit of their potential. There's also something in the act of choosing itself that the paralysis tends to obscure. Every commitment, even an imperfect one, generates information. You learn things from the inside of a decision that you cannot learn from the outside. The career path you're researching will tell you one thing from the research phase and something completely different from inside it. The version of you that makes the imperfect choice and adjusts along the way ends up knowing more than the version that keeps waiting for the perfect one. That's not the same as saying any choice is fine. It's saying that the paralysis loop, whatever it generates, doesn't substitute for the information that only comes from movement. There's a concept in cognitive behavioral therapy called values clarification. The idea being that a lot of anxiety about choice isn't actually about the options themselves. It's about not having articulated, clearly enough, what actually matters to you underneath all of them. When values are vague, every option can be justified and every option can be critiqued. When values are clear, the decision space gets smaller, not because there are fewer options, but because fewer of them are genuinely relevant. For a generation raised in the age of infinite options, the most clarifying work often isn't about expanding what's available. It's about learning to let things go without that feeling like loss. About distinguishing between an open door and a distraction. About finding out what you actually value, rather than what you've been told should be valuable. The hesitation is not evidence of dysfunction. It's evidence of a very particular kind of psychological weather, one that a whole generation has been moving through, often without the language for it. You already knew most of this. You just hadn't quite had the words for all of it at once. Choice paralysis is one of the quieter ways a generation gets shaped by its moment. It shows up in the tabs that stay open, in the decisions that age in the pending folder, in the low-level hum of possibility sitting alongside its opposite. Understanding where it came from and what it actually costs is the beginning of making it smaller.